All right, tonight we got BarrySploit doing a talk on detecting initial access. Um, Before we get started tonight, I am going to do a quick shout out to our sponsor, ArcLight 6 Consulting. They've graciously sponsored Null 404, and we'll have some more information coming soon about that. But with that said, Barry, feel free to kick things off. We'll let you get that started.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Sean. Yeah. Shout out to ArcLight 6. This is actually part the first of a 3-part series in a train up to the CTF that we're going to be hosting in June, sponsored by them, where we're going to have the winner will get that $500 TCM voucher. So yeah, but for those of you that don't know me, I'm Jason Barry, also known as BarrySploit. I've been doing this tech thing for about 8 years now, and today we're going to talk about how attackers get into your network and going over initial access. Feel free if at any point in time you have some stories from the wild that you feel that you want to share. Feel free to speak up, ask questions. So,
Barry, real quick before you get started, my stream is having a problem. Hold on.
No worries.
Let me just switch this out real quick. This happened to me last time.
There is a kind of workshop at the end where in Meetup chat I dropped some forensic artifacts. There's a security event log and a user's ntuser.dat registry hive. So some of the artifacts that we're going to be talking about are in there. And I did do some mock attacks that you'll be able to find in there. So I'll leave the details of that until the end. But make sure that you download those as well as set up some of those Eric Zimmerman tools that I mentioned in the chat as well if you don't already have those installed.
Okay, I think we're back online. Feel free to kick it off.
Awesome. So today we're going to run over initial access. We're going to kind of be following MITRE as our framework here. So initial access is just that first step that's going to happen in that attack cycle, right? So it's how attackers get into your network. The very first opportunity that we really have at stopping malware, stopping the attackers from being able to be into your network, gather information, etc., to do all their attacks on objectives. So like I mentioned earlier, we got some forensic artifacts in the chat. Make sure you go and set those up. There's also a few Eric Zimmerman tools. If you're not familiar with Eric Zimmerman, released publicly, open source, tons of different forensic artifacts for parsing things on Windows. And that's what we're going to primarily be focusing on today. I will have some references to Linux, but I won't be touching too much on Mac OS as Windows really is the predominant operating system in the corporate environment. So, but with that, the only other kind of tactic that we're going to be talking about is credential access, because that is really part of they kind of go hand in hand as credentials are used in a lot of modern attacks, in the sense of attackers don't always need malware anymore. They can use legitimate credentials that they've gathered through phishing, etc. Excuse me. All right. So first thing we're going to talk about, first technique that we're going to talk about is exploiting public-facing applications. In the majority of organizations, you're going to have some type of applications that are public-facing, whether that's a firewall where you're hosting a VPN so you can have your workers work from home, whether you're hosting a website, etc. Anything that is exposed to the internet is going to be scanned. It's going to be attacked. So you need to understand your attack surface. Super easy way to check that is go to Shodan. Once a year, you can get, I think it's lifetime membership for maybe $5. So super worth it. Otherwise, you can just go find your public IP, slap it in there, see what ports you have exposed to the internet. But with that, what does that exploit actually look like and how do we detect that? It's going to kind of depend a lot on what that application is, right? So for example, if you have a web service, you really need to baseline what your web applications are doing on a regular basis. What files are they writing regularly? What sub-processes are being spawned there? And with that, you need to make sure that whatever detection tools you're writing, whether you're using an EDR or you're using you have a SIM where you're doing searches regularly, look for those suspicious process trees. Look for something like W3WP where it's spawning CMD or PowerShell. That might be indicative of a web shell that is on your host, right? As for things like firewalls, making sure that you're up to date on your threat intelligence and making sure that you're still following best practices because 0 days happen, right? Make sure your firewall accounts aren't running as domain admin, for example. Make sure, least privilege, things of that sort. But layers of defense is why we talk about these things. But understanding what that standard activity looks like is really where you build out those detections. Moving on to the next one. You may think, and I think this is a common misconception nowadays, is that malicious USBs don't exist anymore. Everybody's like, it doesn't happen. If you actually saw my last talk, I had a buddy who had a USB. He using business Amazon account, bought a docking station for some of his employees, and it was distributed with some malicious USBs. Luckily, their EDR had caught it, but it just goes to show that within the last year, it is still absolutely a valid attack vector. As for detecting these things, detecting the malicious code, right, that's a thing on itself. But if you're investigating from kind of that DFIR or digital forensics incident response standpoint, when it comes to Windows, I have a few different registry keys here that you can actually go through and check. So, for example, if you want to see what devices were mounted, you can check these registry keys here. If you want to look for those user interactions with those USBs, so for example, in most cases, when somebody plugs in a USB nowadays, auto run is disabled by default on Windows. So although just plugging it in might not infect your device unless it's got some hardware exploitation on there, most of the time it'll have something like a malicious LNK or a malicious shortcut file that the user has to click on. That itself generates its own forensic evidence that we can analyze and use to determine that root cause. So that user interaction we'll see under this user assist registry key. And then whether you know it or not, every single USB you've plugged into your device is stored with serial number, manufacturer information inside the registry as well. Small caveat with that, if you're not familiar with the Windows registry, basically Windows stores all kinds of information about you, and including all your previous Word documents, things of that sort. Every single tiny preference you've ever set is stored somewhere in the registry. With that, we can use all that information for forensics, right? Every Wi-Fi that you visited in the past, you can see last visited times for connects to those networks, first times you connected to those networks, the MAC addresses of the access points, etc. So super, super powerful. I do have a link here that's from Magnet Forensics, where if you want to read more onto detecting USBs getting plugged in, they have this really great article here. Do I have any questions so far?
I was just curious, that's live? Like, you bought those USBs off Amazon and they were malicious?
Yeah. Actually, I have this link and I'll drop it in the chat after this. But I did a whole thing going through it. They came as a docking station, and it was really interesting because they had the genuine drivers for the docking station on there. But in order to get to those, you had to click. It looked like the folder, but it was actually a malicious shortcut. So you click on the malicious shortcut, it runs the malware, and then redirects you to the actual folder that was hidden as a system file, basically, that had the actual drivers in there. So the drivers themselves were malicious. Yeah, it ended up being a whole thing. It was the manufacturer came back and sent my buddy some new USBs after that and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And then when he got the new USBs, they actually had even more malware on them. So
Wow.
it was, yeah, super cool stuff. So awesome. Any other questions so far? Cool. So this is probably where everybody is the most familiar with initial access. I think everybody, whether you are in cybersecurity or not, you know about some type of phishing, right? When I'm creating phishing playbooks, they typically fall into one of two categories. They're either going to be a credential-based phish, where, for example, they are just trying to get your login credentials. There's even adversary in the middle attacks nowadays where uh, it will capture or kind of sit in between you and the legitimate Microsoft services and walk you through your whole MFA process. So that way, once the user is successfully phished, they don't need to go through MFA. They just have your session tokens, so you can go log in and cause havoc, right? The other type of phishing is malware based. So it's trying to trick the user into running their malware. A common one for this is sock ghoulish. That's also this fake Google Chrome update. It looks really legitimate. You'll visit a genuine website. Most of the time, it will be something. It will be. I've seen it a lot with law firms, for example, where they'll be running WordPress. They'll have a vulnerable plugin or something like that. The website gets compromised, and then the threat actors basically inject some malicious JavaScript that every time somebody visits that law firm, they get a pop-up that says, hey, your Google Chrome or Firefox or Edge, it has the logic built in to know which browser you're coming from. It says, hey, it's out of date. You need to download and update it here. Has you download a zip, run some JavaScript, and then they're selling access to your computer on the dark web, right? So yeah, those are the two categories. They're either credentials or malware based, right? And they can get really, really complex nowadays, as I'm sure you're all aware, whether that's via attachments, via links, whether they're calling you over Signal or adding you to Signal group chats, or they are calling you over the phone pretending to be IT, telling you to install some remote management software. If you're interested in talking about RMMs, it's going to be beyond the scope of this, but I did leave a resource here. It's lol.rmm.io. If you want to build out detection rules for detecting some of these RMM tools, absolutely fantastic open source information here on, if you're worried about AnyDesk, TeamViewer, etc., go on there. You can get some really great information for all the artifacts that are created when somebody installs these things. How to detect these things. The attackers are changing things all the time, so it's pretty difficult. Most of the time, it's going to be retroactive. Even things like Proofpoint, Mimecast Defender, you'll get alerts retroactively. Some user clicked on a link, and Proofpoint comes back 2 days later and says, "Oh, by the way, we found out that was malicious." And then you need to go back in time, make sure that user is, didn't end up being have suspicious logins, etc. during that time period. And block your IOCs, right? The other thing that's really useful is dark web monitoring. As attackers kind of shift towards these identity-based attacks and making sure, and selling those credentials on the dark web, selling that access on the dark web, having a service, whether it's, trying to think of a couple off the top of my head, there's Flare and Recorded Future.
Proton.
I think Proton's got some. I think Aura even does some nowadays. There's plenty of solutions out there, but using that for your organization and getting on top of things are really great. Especially now when with info stealers being huge, a lot of those orgs will even see, hey, we found that there was your organization had some stealer logs that were on the dark web, and most of the time, depending on whether it's Redline, etc., you may even see, hey, where did this person, what was the malware running on that host that actually, what directory was it running from? So you can get extra insight to go investigate the endpoints after that. If you're doing a digital forensics investigation, biggest things are going to be looking at users' web history. So if you have an HTTP proxy, whether that's Squid, Zscaler, etc., that's pretty useful to run against and look for some IOCs. Another quick win if you want a threat hunt to go do at your organization, go see if anybody is visiting the Telegram API on your organization. Go see if that's blocked. I see a lot of phishing and info stealers that use that regularly. So Any questions on phishing before I jump into the next steps? Cool. So we'll jump into the malware portion in a little bit, but for those credential phishing, right? Uh, what you, I, I'm sure you all know, when an attacker gets your credentials, what are they going to do? They're going to go log in and do some evil stuff, right? So how did they get access to these accounts? Was it through phishing? Did they do some password attacks? Did they have physical access to the network? And if you're not familiar, they can do a bunch of man-in-the-middle attacks that include like LMNR poisoning, ARP poisoning, etc., where they can sit in the middle. There's even tools such as SSL strip, where you may have TLS connections to Facebook, but there are some workarounds where they can still get access to your credentials that way. So, but regardless of how they get those credentials, they're going to have to log in or interact in some way, shape, or form. With that, there's a couple different ways that we can work on detecting those things, whether that is through some type of user behavioral analysis or UBA tools. I also have it listed as identity protection or different, knowing what your user's typical behavior is, right? Looking for things like that's impossible travel. Somebody logs in from 2 separate countries in the span of 2 hours, right? Or somebody typically, if all your employees work from the United States and somebody's logging in from the UK, you may want to have detections for things like that. If we're talking about password attacks, specifically on Windows, there's few different event IDs that you should be aware of. The biggest ones are those 4624s and the 4625s. 4624s are any successful logins, 4625s are any failed logins. And these are going to be generated on any workstation or the destination that the attacker is logging into. So say, for example, I'm going to pick on CoolCat. If CoolCat has his laptop, his enterprise laptop, plugged in directly to his modem, he has a public IP address on his laptop. Obviously not good, but now he has, SMB, for example, exposed to the internet, and somebody starts brute forcing passwords on there. The 4624s and 4625s are going to be generated on his workstation because that is the destination that the attackers are trying to log into. Even though his host may be a domain, like joined to a domain, these are going to be generated on his workstation. And then on the domain controller, as it's trying to verify those credentials, 4776s, which are, I believe those are the ticket granting tickets, and then the 4768s are the DC trying to validate the credentials. These are actually generated on that domain controller themselves. So if you're collecting event logs from your workstations, not all organizations are, you'll want to look for these. Otherwise, if you're just collecting event logs from your domain controllers, you'll want to be looking for those 4776s and 4768s. So these are the event IDs that you can use to look for those authentication events, specifically on Windows. If we're talking about Linux, in these cases, the file paths that I'm using are for Ubuntu, but auth.log is going to be usually your go-to. But if you have access to the device, there's UTMP, WTMP, BTMP. These are actually files on the host that you can pull off, and then you use the associated commands here to actually see them. So you use the who command pointed at that file. If you're doing forensics, for example, you may not be running those commands on that host itself. You may have a disk image, so you have to pull these files off of there and then run the who pointed at that disk image at this location, for example. So that's the reason I put these there, just because you may not, especially if you're in the middle of an investigation, you may not want to log into an actively compromised host and start running commands, right? So it's important to know how to use these commands when you're not on a live system as well. And then lastly, I kind of just summarized, if you're using a cloud-based identity provider like Okta, Entra, etc., make sure that you're looking at those authentication logs as well. You can get a lot of really good information out of those. So, but those are going to be dependent on whoever your identity provider is. Any questions on this one? I know I'm kind of just dumping information at you. So real quick, I know I mentioned those 4624s and 4625s, those successful logins, these event IDs here. With that, there's a really important portion to each of those event logs that you should be aware of, and it's a really common interview question as well, which is those logon types. So the logon types tell you how they were trying to log in. Was it over the network? Was it over RDP? Were they sitting at the computer trying to do it themselves? And that's really important in investigations, because if somebody's running potentially malicious commands, it's really important to know, are they doing it from a remote location, or is somebody sitting at the terminal, doing these things? So I have a quick reference here. The biggest ones that I think you should you should know are 2 is the interactive. This means somebody put the hands on the keyboard at the computer logging in. Type 3s are anything over the network. So this could be WMI, SMB, any of those network protocols. And then the other most important one, in my opinion, is logon type 10s. And this is anything that is RDP. So if somebody's brute forcing RDP, for example, you're going to see a whole bunch of these logon type 10 events. Any questions on this? Cool. So different types of password attacks. If you've gone and taken Security Plus, you're probably aware of what a brute force attack is, right? Us as, if you're doing DFIR, digital forensics incident response, the biggest question is not yes, we need to be aware of what these attacks are, but also, how do we detect these? What does it look like from the endpoint's perspective? So brute force attacks, somebody trying a whole bunch of login attempts, just trying, biggest things, traditional brute force, lots of passwords for smallest users, or more commonly now, password sprays where you do just a couple of passwords. Maybe you do winter 2025, or I guess what are we, spring 2025 now? You try that password across the entire user base. Then you're not locking out users. It's a little stealthier. So this is kind of the go-to nowadays. But how does that look, right? You may see a single source trying to log in to a large amount of user accounts, right? So thinking about how it applies on how we view it in the logs is really what's most important to detecting these things. So a couple of things that you can look at are, when you're investigating these, how many sources are involved, how many failed attempts are involved, group them by source, how many users were involved, is it a whole lot, is it just a few? And then lastly, and probably the most important part, was there any successes from the potential threat actors, right? Because it's really nice to know, oh yeah, there's a brute force attack going on, but it doesn't help you a whole lot if you don't know, they actually were able to successfully log in to this 1, 2, 3 accounts, right? So in order to move on to remediation, you'd be able to identify that. Any last questions before I start jumping into some malware stuff?
Yeah. So you're mentioning different ways of getting in, I guess. And I sent you a little message about what about malicious USB hid devices like rubber duckies, whatnot.
Yeah, let me take a look. For most of those HID or those HID devices, right? They're are inside of Office. By default, macros will not be enabled, and it's going to require the user to click this enable content button you see on here. Most of the time, the threat actor is going to say, put some type of message in the actual body. So something like this, like, hey, please enable content to see the document. The file opens, click enable editing, then enable content. And once they click this, then the macros will actually run, and it's going to run some malicious code. What actually are those macros? It's genuinely just some code. It's going to be either written in Visual Basic or Excel 4.0, which is really, really old, but it's still sometimes seen, and it's still enabled just for backwards compatibility with Excel applications. Both of these can interact directly with the Windows API. So how some standard malware, maybe using virtual alloc, right? That's kind of Windows 32 API calls. This malware can do the same exact thing. It can call those same exact functions, all within Word or Excel, etc. So how do we actually detect these things? For your environment, if Excel macros or Word macros are not standard, first thing you can do is go hunt for these things. Modernly, they have to be in these docm or these XLSM file formats in order to actually support macros. And then the most simple detection after that is going to be looking for those suspicious parent-child relationships. So anytime that Microsoft Word or WinWord spawns PowerShell or command prompt, etc. Those ones are pretty simple, and most of the time your standard Microsoft Word and Excel are not going to be spawning PowerShell and running commands, right? So as I kind of mentioned before, these macros can get a little more complicated than just these simple parent-child relationships, and attackers have evolved to this. So instead of to avoid this relationship, using the Windows API, they'll use things like WMI or the Windows Management Interface to break that relationship. So, for example, if they're using WMI to run PowerShell commands, it's still going to spawn. It's still going to spawn PowerShell, but now instead the parent process isn't going to be WinWord or Excel. It's going to be this WMI PRVSE. So you'll see this process tree instead. Also, still a good detection on its own, and most of the time WMI is not going to be spawning PowerShell unless that's normal in your environment. But because it can interact directly with Windows API, it really can end up with an endless amount of possibilities for attackers. There's tools out there that can take full executables and run them inside of Visual Basic, inside of an Excel macro. The downside to attackers for that is that if Excel or Microsoft Word is running your malware, the moment that the user closes out Microsoft Word or Excel, it's also going to kill your access to the host. So that's kind of the downside for attackers and why you don't see that very often. But because it's an option, you still may want to detect that type of suspicious activity. If that's the case, the best thing you can do is use something like Sysmon, where if you're not familiar with Sysmon, it's a sysinternals Microsoft application that you can install on your Windows devices. It runs as a service, and it gives you a ton of new telemetry for you to build detections off of. So whether that's DNS requests, process creates, file writes, or module loads like DLL load events, right? So in this case, we can say, hey, anytime that Excel or Word is spawning or is loading suspicious DLLs, like things like CLR.dll, which is used for .NET assemblies, or VBE.dll, anytime you want to run Visual Basic. Unless this is normal in your environment, which it likely is not, these are also some pretty good detections that you can use. If you are up against and you're suspicious of some macros, you can just open it and view the macros inside of Excel or Word. But most of the time, I don't know about you, I don't really want to install Word or Excel, or I definitely don't want to open that on any of my boxes. So the best thing you can do instead, there's a whole GitHub repo out there called, or set of tools called OLE tools, and you can just run OLE VBA, run it against the file you want, and it's going to print out the macros onto the screen for you. It's even got some deobfuscation built in, so if the macros are really complex, it'll point out things like, hey, it's making references to PowerShell, or it's making references to this API, etc. So really easy wins and safe way to analyze these macros. Any questions on macros?
Barry, are you going to go over like RMM tools? I didn't want to steal your thunder. I had a comment about malware
I
in
did.
general.
I am not. So if you want to
Yeah.
jump, if you want to make a comment, feel free to go for it.
Yeah, just a quick comment. So on top of like hunting for like phishing emails, another attack that I've seen is where like an adversary will essentially find like they'll find users at your organization and then email bomb them. So they'll just get spammed with emails, and then they'll send either follow-up emails that say, hey, your inbox is full, or they'll actually call your users. So it's more of a social engineering technique where they'll call the user and say, hey, we notice we're IT, we notice that you're having email issues, like we're here to help. And then they'll have them download RMM tools to basically give the attacker access to the environment, and then they can spread laterally from there. I've seen some Russian-based threat actors do this, specifically Curly Spider. If you look them up, you can find some more information about them. But that's another tactic that adversaries are using outside of like Word and Excel macros. So hunting for specific, like if you look up RMM tools like Screen Connect and things like that, hunting for those RMM tools in your environment can also help. So if you have like an application listing of the different tools that you're leveraging, or if you can determine even hunt on browser extensions too, and look for like unauthorized VPNs or unauthorized RMM tools, that could be a really great indicator of, hey, like make sure your users don't have any unauthorized like RMM tools or VPN services in the environment, because they could potentially be compromised. That's another way to hunt through those as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I dropped that link in the chat, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but there's that lolrmm.io. If you want to start hunting those down in your organization, great place. Gives you all the file paths, registry keys, log locations, etc. for each of those RMM tools, so you can start hunting those down. Yeah, super common for threat actors because it's a way for them to avoid having to write malware that we can detect with some of the methods that we're talking about today. But absolutely good point, Sponger. Appreciate it. Awesome. So the hot thing right now for phishing, at least in my opinion, is the fake CAPTCHAs. When this started becoming a thing, I don't know about your guys' socks. If you work in a sock, this was the most befuddling thing ever, because basically the way that this works is the user gets to this CAPTCHA, might be something looking legitimate, but in order to actually view this this invoice, right, you got to go through this CAPTCHA. You click on the box and it says, hey, just run these couple keys real quick. Pulls up the run dialog, pastes in a malicious command, they press enter, bam, they are now infected. Usually it's going to be something like MITRE, MSHTA, PowerShell, or some CMD, some malicious command to pull down another malicious file, right? A stage 2, if you will, and execute it. The weird thing for defenders when this first started becoming a thing was that the parent process is explorer.exe. If you're not familiar, when you log into Windows, how you have the file explorer or how you have the taskbar at the bottom, all of that is part of explorer.exe. So it is an absolutely normal process that users interact with regularly. So for explorer.exe to be spawning this malicious PowerShell or MITRE, really curious. Most of the time it's reference to, hey, was there persistence before? So, go search for persistence and you don't find any. You're like, okay, where did this thing come from? It seemingly came out of nowhere. Well, luckily now we know about it. So there's a pretty decent, the best way to detect this or to find evidence of it is to go to whatever the user that ran it. There's a registry key that is associated directly with that user. It's going to be located in C users, the username, and then ntuser.dat. But if you open up that registry key, if you go to this path, software, Microsoft Windows current version, blah, 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 but there's this run MRU. This will show you everything that user has ran from that run dialog box. And it'll show you the order and when it was ran. So if they ran some malicious PowerShell or malicious CMD, etc., you will find that evidence here. So yeah, if you're not aware, that's the way to check it. A couple other delivery methods for delivering malware that has been somewhat popular over the last couple years is password protected zips. So if you are not blocking inbound zips for email, it's super common, and most of the time people are not legitimately sending zips via email. Things that I've seen in the past are, for example, is you may have a 10 megabyte zip file. However, when the user gets it, the email may instruct them, it may have a password, for example, but the email will say, hey, here's this legal document, here's the password, we're super secure, so we're coming from a quote compromised law firm. But it's super small, but when they unzip it, it's actually gigabytes. Most of the time, it's just null bytes that are slapped at the end of the file. So it'll be imagine a actual 10 megabyte executable, and then basically 2 gigabytes of nothing but zeros. And the reason that attackers do this is because when files are over a certain size, most AVs will have a size limit, and it won't scan that entire file just to save basically user experience. It's going to take up too much time. It's going to slow down the system too much. Same type of idea why attackers add sleeps, right? With things like this, some common detection mechanisms. When people download something from the internet, there is a alternate data stream or an ADS that gets added on there, and it'll be zone.identifier. And what you can do is basically create a detection that looks at a file path and says, hey, look for anything that is a zip, but also has an executable with a zone identifier. So if it has a zone identifier, there's a couple different things on there, but most of the time it's going to be the value is going to say 3, which means that it was downloaded from the internet. And yeah, it can be pretty tough. That's pretty decent detection for those. Yeah, so common thing that I've seen in the past. I think most commonly I've seen it with REMCOS rat. So another common thing, I think it was popular with Iced ID a while back, was ISOs that were emailed over. So that most users don't know what an ISO is, so they don't know the wiser. They download this ISO and they double click it. It automatically mounts onto your system, and on there is just one shortcut related to whatever the lure was. When they click that shortcut, if you're not aware, shortcuts can end up basically being a shortcut to anything. So a lot of cases, it'll be a shortcut to PowerShell with a custom icon, and it'll have some malicious command line arguments. So it'll run PowerShell that downloads and runs something else. The interesting with analyzing ISOs from a defer perspective is it's a little weird to detect, because we can detect the drive being mounted, but actually getting the content of the ISO or the shortcut itself is kind of difficult. So whenever you might see where the LNK went to, or where the shortcut went to, like PowerShell, but seeing the information of the link itself is tough. By default, Windows, every time you click on something and launch it, in this path, user profile, app data roaming, etc. It creates a shortcut here for whatever the file name was. So you might be able to get some information about the name of the shortcut and what drive it was on. If you want to parse this, there's a separate Eric Zimmerman tool. It's called, I think it's LECMD for parsing link files. So you may not get the contents of the shortcut, but you'll know that it was there and also that the ISO was mounted. So a couple of different ways to detect or investigate this one. Any questions on this?
Yeah, Barry, this has been great. So as far as like mounting an ISO, could we also just like pull up a GUI on the machine and look at the drive?
Yeah. If you have access to the ISO,
Yeah, while you do that, Barry, you said that we can go ahead and like check out that security EVT. Would that be with the timeline explorer?
Yeah, exactly. So high level, as I get this pulled up, you'll parse it with EVTX CMD. You can also use built-in event viewer, but it's kind of a hassle to do any real in-depth analysis with them. So parse it into a CSV and then pull it up in that timeline explorer.
Nice. All right, cool. Thanks.
Yep.
Hey Barry, are you gonna reshare your screen?
Yeah, I'm getting OPSEC. I'm cleaning up some stuff. Sorry.
Yeah, sounds good.
I realized that all my files are in a odd folder, so.
Yeah, and then for those that are on the live stream, some reason I have no idea. Discord is like not streaming at all for me on my streaming rig. So I have this recorded though, so I'll have to make cut this and repost it later. So yeah.
All right, I'll go ahead and reshare. Just moving a file, removing these files here real quick. It didn't copy all the files. Bummer. It wouldn't be a demo if I didn't run into issues, right?
Absolutely correct.
All right, here we go. All right, so when you actually have this EVTX CMD, basically this is the Eric Zimmerman tool to parse event logs and put them into a CSV file format. CSVs are basically, I think of them as a ghetto Excel sheet, more simplified version of Excel sheet. But the standard what we're going to do here to parse this, we're going to point it at the exe, and then we're going to do -F to point it at a file. You can also point it at a directory if you use -D, but we're going to point it at the file. I use the security event log. And then lastly, we're going to do --CSV and then tell it where we want to dump it. So I'm going to just dump it in the current directory. And that's pretty much the general command line arguments for every single one of the Eric Zimmerman tools. The guy has a standard, and that's pretty much it. You're going to do either -F for a single file or a -D for a directory, and do --CSV, and then where you want to dump that CSV at. All right, and it's just parsing all these, so there we go. Took 34 seconds, and then parse all of these event logs. You see how many are actually here. So you see here's these 4624s, and there are a whole lot. There's these 4625s, and there's 56. So 56 failures. Perfect. And then let me go ahead. I'm going to open up Timeline Explorer. Change what I'm sharing. All right. So once you actually get it parsed, this is Timeline Explorer. Really great tool where basically the reason that I prefer this over using something like Excel is that the filtering possibilities are fantastic. Meaning that we can broadly search across every single field by using this search box in the upper right. Or if we have specific columns that we want to filter on, we can do that as well. So for example, here's remote hosts. We can see it looks like there's not a whole lot of entries at first. But if we wanted to see everything, say for example, we're going remote host. If you hover over it, there's this little filter icon in the top right corner. If you click on that, in this case it's all blanks, but find one that's not all blanks. I don't think it parsed correctly because I copied all the files over weirdly. Dang. I copied everything to a new directory and I jacked it up. All right, well, let's do event IDs. So for example, if I click on this little filter icon for event IDs, I can see all the event IDs that came in this log. And I can just go down and click exactly which ones I want. Say, for example, I also want to filter for process ID. What we can also do is if we want to group by something, you can actually drag it to the top up here, and now it's grouped by that. So now everything that has process ID 644 is now under here. Everything that has process ID this is under here, and we can even get counts for each of these. So we can filter by columns and group by things all in this one tool, which makes it pretty fantastic for analyzing data. Any questions on Timeline Explorer? Only other things, I know I mentioned this text box up here if you want to broadly search, or if you want to get rid of the filters, you can actually just uncheck them or click the X here at the bottom and get rid of those filters. So. Cool. Any questions on this one? Cool. If not, I'm going to jump shares one more time, and I'll show you how to use Registry Explorer, which is the one other tool that I recommended from the meetup text. So, I'm going to share my whole screen for this one. So this is Registry Explorer once you get it open. you can either load a live system or we can load a specific hive. In this case, let me grab our entuser.dat. And then once I get it loaded up, we can see, here's the path. If you want to see deleted records, it has the different deleted records that were in here as well that are still allocated. I guess they are unallocated, but the record still exists. And then you can go through all of these manually. However, one of the awesome things with Registry Explorer is it has these bookmarks. So if you click on bookmarks, these are all of the kind of forensically important registry keys. And it will already pre-process some of the data for you. So for example, user assist, by default, don't ask me why it is this way. But if you go look up the user assist registry key on your system right now, every single entry is ROT13 encoded. No clue who decided that was going to be a thing, but that is how it is. And so you can see in the description, it contains a list of ROT13 encoded values, and it automatically gets rid of all of those. So it automatically ROT13 decodes all this data for you and puts it in a readable format. We can see how often people have focused on things, what the run count is, and when most of these things were last executed. And then lastly, you can see if we go to this run MRU key that we referenced previously, you can actually see in this case, there's this encoded PowerShell command that was ran. So yeah, perfect. And if there are multiple entries in here, you'll see them under this MRU position, and the lower number means the sooner that it happened. Or you can look at this opened on date, but I believe this would just show up for the most recent entry. So, but yeah, that's basically using Registry Explorer. So if, for example, you wanted to come in here and look at anything like how we referenced Wi-Fi registry keys, right? Go load the registry key for that. I think that one's HKLM instead, or the local machine key. But go check those bookmarks and start clicking through here and see what you're able to find. I'm sure you'll be surprised at some of the things you find. So, awesome. Any questions on using these tools? Did anybody have issues getting their stuff to parse? Otherwise, whenever you figure out which user was successfully brute forced, shoot me a DM and I'll let you know if you're right. But otherwise, thank you guys for attending my talk. I hope you learned something. If there's anything you want to follow up on, feel free to stick around, ask me questions, or shoot me a DM. I'm always happy to have discussions about cool cyber shit. So,
Thanks, Barry. That was awesome.
thank you.
buddy.
Appreciate it.
Great talk, man.
Appreciate it, dude. Yeah, we're gonna do 2 more of these. I believe our next train up for the CTF will be on detecting persistence and the different persistence methods, and then the last one will be on detecting lateral movement and different lateral movement techniques. So
Yeah, I was just about to ask about that one.